So you've just finished your playthrough of Oblivion, Skyrim, or maybe Morrowind if you're extra quirky, and now you'd like to take that experience to the tabletop realm. How do you do it? Well, I hope that this video will help you with that process. I want to go over a few different elements that'll be important for running an Elder Scrolls game. I've identified 4 basic things you'll need to know that could help you in running your own game and creating your own campaign in the Elder Scrolls setting. So first of all, some basic background. I'm sure you know all of this if you clicked on this video, but just a basic refresher first, unless you finished the game a while ago, back in 2011, and are still waiting for Elder Scrolls 6. Basically, this is a fantasy world, takes place on a planet named Nirn, continent called Tamriel. There's a few races, there's elves, there's stuff. Isn't really dwarves, that's kind of not a thing anymore. But yeah, other than that, pretty standard fantasy setting. But there are a few distinctive traits of the Elder Scrolls, and this is what brings us to our first topic. What makes Tamriel, the main continent of the series, unique, and why would you want to run a game there instead of in a different fantasy setting? What do you want to use for your campaign that's really going to take advantage of the setting you're using? And I really think the answer to that is the politics. Many fantasy settings either go for a high amount of realism or no realism at all. And what I'm talking about with no realism at all is things that could never happen in the real world. So imagine Sauron, right? He's got this political ambition to unite the world in a kind of grand order, which is sort of misguided. But he's lived for eons and eons and eons, and you sort of get the sense that he's become jaded towards humans and that he wants to oppress them because he feels they can't run themselves. Now, a person in the real world could still have this opinion, but at a time scale such as his, obviously that could never occur. On the more realistic side, some fantasy settings are like World of Warcraft, where there are leaders who employ nationalism or rhetoric that we would recognize in our own timeline, such as Garrosh Hellscream. The Elder Scrolls is interesting in that it kind of walks the line between those two. You have factions like the Thalmor, which are clearly fascistic and have many elements from real-world governments, but you also have things like Leng and the Daedra, which are, clearly not like that. Even demons in a more realistic setting like World of Warcraft, even demons have politics and interpersonal relationships. They're more like humans. In the Elder Scrolls, that is far less true. And while there are governments and echoes of our own history in the setting, they don't dominate it as they do in World of Warcraft and other realistic settings. Like, I'm sure you can imagine many. Example that's just coming to mind right now would be like Game of Thrones. Very realistic, unfortunately. So you really want to hone in on that element, I think, because that's something unique that you're not going to find in just your plain old fantasy setting. Imagine this. You've got a campaign where you're basically doing some political intrigue. Maybe you're even doing a modified version of the Thalmor quest from Skyrim, where you're at a banquet and there's intrigue. There's a fun campaign about politics where you can influence what'll happen in the world next. Maybe there's a war going on. I'm sure you've heard of this plot before. Then you throw in a twist. And this could be something like, this is all being manipulated by some ancient eldritch being. Now, in World of Warcraft, in Game of Thrones, you'd have this problem of these two elements are going to really, really clash. And you can still do it, but it's going to be a lot more difficult. And, this is why The Winds of Winter is taking so long to come out. But with the Elder Scrolls, you have less of that problem because you have more examples of the two interacting in the past in the setting. For example, Oblivion is a good one with the Mythic Dawn cult. The Mythic Dawn are a group that opposes this long-standing and often tyrannical empire, but they are being used ultimately by an ancient demon who cares nothing for human life. So you can really blend these elements together quite seamlessly in the Elder Scrolls setting because you have a lot to draw on. So like I was talking about with that political plot I just mentioned, that hypothetical Thalmor one, let's say you're doing this intrigue quest and you're learning clues to some kind of political mystery, and you get to the point where you're in the penultimate or ultimate confrontation, and you're talking to the main elf baddie, right? And he's talking, he's doing his monologue. And then maybe you just have the advisor of his or his court wizard or whatever just say, like, no, like, we're not going to do what you want anymore. And then he just starts talking about like the ancient world, just starts talking about some kind of grand plan. He just starts talking about like crazy stuff that your players have never encountered yet in your campaign. Maybe he starts talking about historical events that took place before the Dawn era, like the earliest era in the timeline of the Elder Scrolls. Or he starts, talking about some kind of huge plan that he's been orchestrating, of which the main villain was only a small part. So that's a really cool element of the Elder Scrolls that you can weave into your campaign in order to have really cool moments, because it's like a oh shit moment for your players. They're kind of like, you thought that the story was this big and now it's twice as big. You do want to use those sparingly because you don't want everything to be like planned out by the gods. That makes things kind of boring and have a little less worth, I think. But if used at the correct moment, it can add a lot of impact to big moments. Next, I want to talk about what thematic elements you want to use in your Elder Scrolls game. So the Elder Scrolls has a lot of recurring themes, which you probably should incorporate in some way into your own campaign in order so that the players can have some familiarity with what they're seeing and it feels like the Elder Scrolls. Because you don't ever want to have a campaign in a setting where you kind of just do whatever you want and you don't really respect the feeling of the source material. Even if you have all the characters from an original story, if you don't present them in a similar way to how it is in the show, book, or video game that you're adapting from, people just aren't going to believe it. And so that's also important when you're running an RPG in a pre-existing setting, like the Elder Scrolls. So, what thematic elements should you use and what recurs in the Elder Scrolls that you should be using for yourself? A big one is evil wizards. Wizards are usually evil in this setting. Even the first game, Elder Scrolls Arena, it's pretty much an evil wizard who's doing all of that. In the second game, it's a bunch of ancient wizards who created a giant god. In the third game, it's a group of magical beings, a little bit different. Oblivion, it's a bunch of warlocks who have summoned demon portals. And Skyrim, it's kind of like a magic dragon. That one's a little different. But evil wizards are a very recurring motif in the series. And these wizards are usually tied to a powerful demon who doesn't really respect their mission. So if you have an evil mage in your Elder Scrolls campaign, it's a good idea sometimes, as much as you want to have the warlock be ultimately a tool and not extremely powerful in the grand scheme of things. And you can tie that into the first thing I mentioned. You have this super powerful warlock who's like making these big plays, maybe even like conquering some locations that your players will recognize, like Kvatch or I don't know, Dawnstar. I don't know. It's just the first city in Skyrim that came to mind. But by the end of the campaign, or maybe even before, if you're really ramping things up, you could show this Daedra's larger plan in some kind of way. So maybe you take a brief excursion to this Daedric Lord's realm of Oblivion, or if it's a lesser Daedra, wherever they're hanging out in Oblivion. And you show other portals, not just to the Warlock's main base, but to many other bases, not even just around Tamriel, but all over the known universe. And so this can be your like, oh crap moment. This is way bigger than we thought. And it also serves this thematic element of evil wizards, who don't really matter to their Daedric masters. Another recurring element in the Elder Scrolls is realistic political conflict, which masks like some kind of darker event. And this is also tied to the other two, of course. It's sort of a variant of them. So you've got the whole Mythic Dawn assassination of Uriel Septim, that whole thing. It's just a plan, right? It's like a surface level thing. And the bigger plot line is this plan to overrun Nirn with demons. So in your own story, you can have this interesting, engaging plot line that's happening in the normal world with normal characters who aren't immortal demons. But maybe you reveal that underneath that, maybe there's like sprites who are trying to restore nature, and that's why they're orchestrating a war, is to like decrease the population. Just an example. And another thematic element that is fairly recurring are titles. Now, titles are very important in the Elder Scrolls series because usually the protagonists of the games are not named. And so they're named with titles in order to have them be able to appear in literature and future games without having to give a canon name for the player's character that they made in the last game because, well, nobody wants that. They want to name the character themselves. So it's a good idea early in your campaign to reflect this by having some really cool titles for your player to earn, or for your players to earn. So let's say you have your players fighting a big troll or something, and maybe you could call them troll slayers. And then over the course of the campaign, each one of them could get their own title, which they'll then be referred to by NPCs. And this also prevents you from having to learn the really complicated names they're going to come up with themselves. And it's just badass. They're just going to like it. So by giving them titles like that, you can also steal that same technique that the devs use. And in your next campaign, or if you're going to run a next campaign, you can reference those characters by the titles. Now, you don't need to do that, of course, because you know their names and they're not going to change like they would in Oblivion, Skyrim, or Morrowind. But it will make it feel more like it's in the setting because you're replicating the source material in a way that feels authentic, and people will respect that or they won't notice it. So it'll either be just nothing or good. You're not gonna, it's a good idea. And next, I want to move on to villains, stories, ongoing stories, that is, and just interesting entry points into the setting. So who's going to be your villain? What stories are going to be going on at the same time? The players are going to appreciate it if you can weave your campaign into events that are going on in the games. Now, there are some players who want just the opposite. They don't want to be part of the canon story at all. Those people do exist. But I've found that the broader part of people want to have something that's somewhat familiar. They don't want to play the stuff they've already played because that would be boring, but they kind of want it to riff off of that in some way. So, Arena is not a good entry point. I'm going to start with that. Don't set a game in Arena unless you're prepared for a challenge. Because Arena, most of the lore is not really in line with the current version of the lore. It has a very different tone, and you're not going to find any good art of any of the characters that isn't like really cool pixel art, but it might kind of clash with what you're doing. You also don't want to put this during the Merethic era or the Dawn era or any of those really early historical time periods, because you're going to be forced to reveal big secrets about the lore early on, because these will be times in which people know all kinds of, ancient lost truths that are ancient and lost by the time of the games, but probably are not very ancient nor very lost by the time of the Merethic or Dawn era. So I would say you really want to be considering first era to the current time in the timeline. You don't really want to be looking at that super early stuff. Now, again, you can set your game whenever you want, but you're going to have more of a challenge there. So those are bad entry points. What are good entry points? Stormcloak War. The Stormcloak Rebellion is a great entry point because it's simple enough to understand, but it can get complex if you want to take it there. It's very simple on the surface. There's a guy, his name is Ulfric Stormcloak, killed the king, and now he wants to take over, and his people are called the Stormcloaks. Fairly simple. The Empire doesn't want him to. Great. You can fight a war. Both of the sides have a pretty cool aesthetic, I think. You got the cool, like, kind of blue Vikings, and you got the red sort of Roman-looking guys. People like that kind of stuff. But if you want it to get more deep and thematic, and you want to address more, like, hard themes, you absolutely can. So you can have it be, like, the dichotomy between, like, freedom and oppression, and is the Empire really good, even though they pretend to be good, or the Stormcloak's actually incompetent and they're just going to ruin everything. And the Stormcloaks are also racist. You could bring that in. You're totally fine to ignore all of that if you want, because some people don't want to play a game like that and they don't care about that. But if your players want that and they're cool with that and you can do it well, then that's a great kind of expansion on that entry point, and you can take it to a whole new level. Next good entry point, the Thalmor War, the war against the Thalmor. So there was a big war, basically, where the Thalmor and the Empire had a fight and some stuff happened, and basically the Empire got dishonored, and this is the reason for the Stormcloak Rebellion, very simply. Now, this is a great opportunity for a campaign because it's chaotic, and you can have a lot of crazy shit happen. So imagine, there's these huge armies of elves in the Empire, which is, a mixed army of different races fighting each other. You've got battles happening. There's battlefields to loot, probably. Maybe they're looking for advantages in ancient ruins that they can hire your characters to go look into. So this is a really, really lucrative age. And you can have characters of all different races traveling all over the world, being mercenaries or treasure hunters or profiteers or whatever you want. So, yeah, it's a good campaign. And again, it has the same appeal as the Stormcloak one entry point, because you can take those themes to a higher level if you want to. You can talk about war, you can have brutality, you can have fascism from the Thalmor and also fascism from the Empire. You can talk about the Argonians fighting the Dark Elves, and you can have all these different kind of things in it. So it's a good entry point because it can work as a complicated campaign and also as a simple, there's a war, you want to loot stuff kind of experience. And the third and last entry point I'm going to talk about is Morrowind. So the game that is Morrowind is essentially about the rivalry between three ancient houses of Dark Elves who surround an ancient volcano in which sits a bronze god created by an ancient race of people. And a group of essentially traitors to their own species, gods, watch over this statue and are trying to claim its power for their own. And they actually care nothing for the people who worship them. If this sounds like extremely badass, that's because it is, and it's a great part to put your campaign in. You got these rival houses, so you can have a ton of intrigue. They can be like sabotaging each other or planting evidence against each other, getting each other in jail. So that's, of course, rife with possibilities for an adventure. Just thinking off the top of my head, one of the heirs of a house has been accused of some kind of horrible crime, and you got to collect evidence to clear their name. I mean, that's just like 2 seconds of thought there. You could go insane with this time period. You also have a lot more access to Morrowind at this time because it's before the explosion of Red Mountain. And so you're not going to have to deal with like crazy ash demons everywhere, which is kind of annoying in Solstheim DLC. But anyway, so you can also have like the Netches and all these weird insects, and Morrowind is just very unique. And lastly, I want to end actually on a negative note. Why not? The problems with the setting and things that you should avoid and not run, stay away from and shun. And I think the biggest thing that is problematic in the Elder Scrolls setting is the time scales. There is so much time between events. There's like thousands of years where just nothing happens. And this is good in some ways because you can set a lot of stuff there, right? I mean, Elder Scrolls Online very much takes advantage of this fact. But it also means that if you want characters to live through multiple extremely important events, you're just kind of out of luck. Like, you're just kind of out of luck. Unless they're an elf, it's just not going to happen. You pretty much you need entry points because you can't really have a game that bridges multiple parts of the timeline. And that's a big problem because if you're not an elf, if you're just a human, you're probably just going to be doing nothing if you just plant somebody randomly in the timeline. Of course, you're not going to do that, but it means that the setting is less rich because you can't go anywhere and find a story. You have to look for it. And I honestly think the timeline ought to be compressed because it's quite bare right now. It's got a lot of really cool things in it, but they're just so damn spaced out. I mean, it's like you want somebody to go through 2 wars, you got to bend over backwards. You got to make him an elf. So there is another problem, and this is the dragon break problem. Now, dragon breaks are essentially points in the timeline where the writers don't want to come up with lore that makes sense. And so they say that this is a weird time break time and anything can happen. These are really disruptive to the setting because they don't actually give many opportunities for stories. You can do whatever you want in them because weird time hijinks, but also you can do whatever you want in them. Why not just make a new setting that would be more conducive to the story you want to tell? Why try to adapt the setting to something it isn't supposed to do when you can just make a new setting? So I'm going to really urge you. I know it's tempting. Stay away from dragon breaks. They're bad for you and bad for your health. Of course, you want to set your game during one, you do whatever you want. But personally, I think if you're setting a game during a dragon break, you should take a look at your material, a look at your story, and think, is there a setting or some idea you have for a setting that would be better suited to this story? Because every time I have done that, I have found that the answer has been yes. There is something that is better suited to this, and I'm just using a dragon break because the Elder Scrolls setting does not have a good point for this story. So that means nothing during ESO. Sad times. But honestly, I think what you want to do if you're going to use ESO material is just say there isn't a dragon break and everything is normal and this is just part of the timeline, and you'll just have to iron out all the inconsistencies yourself. Have fun with that. Other than that, you might have some players who want to know more about the Akavir stuff or the other continent stuff, and oh, Yokuda, what happened to the Yokudans? And I have a parable for you. Okay, a kept secret is a useless secret. All right, and there's a lot of kept secrets in the Elder Scrolls. So you can set up a lot of these mysteries, but you can't really pay them off because there's no payoff. There's nobody knows. It's just not part of the timeline. So you kind of have to bait the player with these things if you want to use them and then just sort of never answer them, which can be really cool. But when you don't have a choice, that's not really cool. You can't choose to reveal or not reveal. You just can't reveal it unless you want to make something up, which is fair. So that's kind of a problem. I know some people would actually see that as a benefit, but I think that it's always good to have a choice. And if you just simply don't have a choice, that's always worse than having the ability to do something, even if you don't want to do it. All right, and that's basically all I wanted to talk about tonight. Um, the Elder Scrolls is a great setting to put your players through. There's a lot of opportunities for cool stories. And I've actually converted some of the races into 5e, which is probably the setting you're going to be using for it. Um, and so I'll probably do a video on that and some other parts of the setting as I finish them. In the meantime, thank you for watching.